Hi, everybody. This is Orlando Bailey, Engagement Director for BridgeDetroit. And here joining me today is former Detroit Police Department Chief Ralph Godbee, now Chief for Detroit Public Schools Police Department. Chief Godbee, thank you for joining me.
Orlando, it is an absolute pleasure to be with you. You are literally a bright spot in so many areas of your life, but definitely as a journalist, it's just good to have your voice out here.
Wow, I appreciate. Wow, wasn't ready for that. I appreciate that. Thanks, Chief. That means a lot coming from you, for you especially. So, I want to talk about the recent announcement by the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District, Matthew Snyder, yesterday, and specifically around this surge in funding and federal officers through this new operation called Operation Legend. And why that's happening at this particular time, in the time of pandemic, in the time of anti-racism protests and conversations about reimagining policing in this country. This seems like, it just seems weird, and I want to get your take on that.
Well, to me, and from my perspective, first of all, I think Chief Craig and Mayor Duggan are in an unenviable position. Because on a day-to-day basis, absent the presence of number 45, regardless of who the president is, you have to work with your federal partners. But what I find egregious about this is the political pandering that Attorney General Barr, if you watch his testimony, President Trump, as he continues, I won't even say to dog whistle, but these are just overtures to the worst of America's original sin, society, and it appeals to some of the worst characteristics of white supremacy, white nationalism, just sheer divisiveness of identifying democratically ran cities, urban areas that are predominantly Black, and to send federal agents in as if those cities are not competent or capable of governing themselves. It's federal overreach to an extent that in my 33 years of law enforcement, Orlando, I have not seen, absent some major situation like September 11th of 2001. Well, obviously you expect a heavy federal presence when the country is under a literal attack from an enemy, and a terrorist enemy at that. Going back to Rodney King and the LA riots, when they had to restore order in LA, there was a federal contingent imposed upon that. But outside of those two incidents in my lifetime, just for a sheer political point, for a flailing president who has failed this country miserably in his leadership capacity to politicize the military, to politicize federal law enforcement, and unfortunately, and I'll use this term, soldiers, officers, they move by command. So you have to really hold responsible and accountable where the call is coming from. And that clearly lands in the lap of Attorney General Barr and Donald Trump. You can't escape that. And it's just so blatantly transparent as to what their aim is. And I'll stop on saying this to a couple of other things. But on the heels of today, as we discussed just previous to coming on air, when we honor a civil rights icon, a legend, when we hear from probably the greatest, I know the greatest president of my lifetime, Barack Hussein Obama, as he eulogized John Lewis and spoke to those aspirational things that America espouses to be, even though it has not always lived up to what it espouses to be. To see that level of excellence and then see a president tweet that he wants to delay the election, which only benefits him. And then you look at the federal insurgents of law enforcement, Portland, Detroit, Chicago. It is reprehensible, and it should be criminal what's being done right now.
It actually, for me, screams violence.
Yes,
I think it is.
It does.
I think it is violent, the kind of rhetoric that the president unleashed today on Twitter around delaying the election in November, especially in the wake of us having to eulogize and put Congressman John Lewis into his final
Right.
resting place. I want to talk to you a little bit about the optics
Yes.
of this and get your thoughts on how the press conference looked, whereby every slated speaker at this press conference was a white male speaking with authority about what they plan to do in a city that happens to be the nation's largest majority Black city.
The optics are horrible. You know, I don't care how you want to spin it, what you want to say. It is symptomatic of why white supremacy and the notions of white supremacy and white privilege. So even if you don't ascribe to something as nefarious as white supremacy, it certainly speaks to white privilege. And when you look at that, and when our country is one that respects local jurisdictions and local governing, and particularly from a party, the Republican Party, that has always espoused smaller government. So under the backdrop of a city that is majority Black, 80% African-American, and then you would interject into its politics a level of policing. Number one, we have not had, and that, you know, I would like to take some credit. I give Chief Craig credit, going back to William Hart and how the city of Detroit was reformed under a new charter that has civilian oversight. You can say what you want about the acumen or the different tactics of law enforcement application, but to a chief, from Chief Hart until current Chief James Craig, our chiefs are responsive to and community oriented and answer to the community and have civilian oversight. So a lot of the issues you see in police departments across the country are not as profound in Detroit, even though systemically all law enforcement needs to be, blown up and just start from the beginning. I get the argument for defunding. I'm a supporter, which a lot of people find.
You're a supporter of defunding. You're of defunding the police, and yes, specifically that rhetoric.
That rhetoric.
Tell me why.
The reason why is because if you look at the foundations of policing in America, the father of modern policing is a gentleman by the name of Sir Robert Peel, who in the 1800s wrote what's called the 9 Peelian Principles that really talk about what policing is to look like in a civilized society. The United States, even though we have tried to talk about the Peelian Principles, the reality is United States policing started with slavery. Been about controlling Black and brown behavior through violence, through intimidation and fear, and then for majority of the European population, protecting and serving. There has always been 2 levels of policing in the United States. So foundationally, if you have a bad foundation, anybody knows anything about building, you're gonna have a bad house, you're gonna have a bad building. So law enforcement and criminal justice in the US is built on a bad predicate, and that predicate was slave patrols. And it's still, you may do it with a smile. You may have more integrated police departments, but systemically, it fundamentally is the same thing. Controlling Black and brown behavior in urban communities and disenfranchised in one way, but serving more affluent communities and the European population in another way. The system fundamentally has not changed. It took me not long into my police career, Orlando, to realize that I don't doubt that the vast majority of police officers join with a level of nobility in mind to be of service. And I still don't doubt that the majority of police officers conduct their business in that way. But the system is so racially tinged and disadvantaged to Black and brown people, whether you're Black or white, whether you do it with a smile or whether you are just overtly a horrible cop. Systemically, policing and criminal justice do not favor Black and brown communities.
You know, I said this on our podcast, Authentically Detroit, and it's a quote by a friend of mine who said, "We are treating the fish when the water is sick.
That's
We continue
very
to
well put.
treat symptoms instead of
Yes.
plucking something at the root, plucking that out and starting all over." I'm
Yes.
glad you mentioned this conversation right now around defunding the police. Governor Whitmer has been requesting additional resources for COVID relief, but to no avail to the federal government and to the Trump administration. But Detroit gets an influx of funding through this Operation Legend to the tune of $3.8 million. What do you make of it?
That can go a long ways towards PPE. That can go a long ways towards funding for meals for people that are disenfranchised. That can go a long way towards meeting so many socioeconomic needs that it is, it really is a symbol of how backwards our system is, especially in urban areas and Black and brown communities, where there's always excuses. Well, we can't afford to have more sociologists. We can't have more psychologists. We can't afford more psychiatrists. We can't afford more social workers. But we continue to invest in one thing in Black and brown communities, and that is in policing, militarizing the police department, getting bigger guns, getting tanks, higher salaries. Everything we do in urban areas from an investment standpoint, we don't invest in those fundamental things that would negate the need for as many police as we have. Joanne Watson said this better than anything. She always reminded me of this as she sat on city council. And she would say, Chief, that the greatest crime prevention tool is a job. And when you look in disenfranchised areas,
Reverend Joanne Watson.
Reverend Joanne Watson, keep the acronym KISS, keep it simple, stupid, and she would always, kind of bring it, that very basic thing to me. And, I'm so fortunate that in my police career, at the time I came up, hired when the late great Mayor Coleman A. Young was mayor, and really revolutionized and integrated a very, very oppressive and abusive police department. Those are the people that taught me about the responsibility a police department, and particularly Black police officers, have towards their community, and their responsibility not to replicate the behaviors of oppressive policing. However, systemically, I just think the system is just so broken and so dysfunctional, and the culture is so tainted, even to the extent where the FBI, and it's very not reported enough, Orlando, of the infiltration of police departments by white supremacists and KKK members. The FBI had done studies on that, and they know that that is a tact of theirs. So when the system is that, when you have a cancer like that and it's metastasized, at a point, you've got to really look at tearing it all down and building it back up from the original intentions of what a police agency is supposed to be.
Can we talk about federal agencies partnering with localities and municipalities like the city of Detroit? There was a habitual mention on part of the feds in yesterday's press conference of its partnership and endorsement of Chief James Craig and Mayor Mike Duggan, which sort of surprised me because last week when the mayor and the chief talked about some sort of federal intervention in what's happening in Detroit, they rejected it. It seems like they're welcoming it now. What does partnership supposed to look like when you have an influx of 52 federal officers coming in to support the anti-crime methods and work of the Detroit Police Department? What does that do to the police department in terms of morale, and how do police officers work with feds? And then I want to ask you about the streets and how the tension and the uncertainty that is going on in communities right now when we hear this influx of money coming and this influx of feds to the streets of Detroit.
Well, one thing I committed to do when James Craig was named chief of police, people don't really realize some of the backroom pressures when you actually sit in the seat. So I'm not going to comment specifically about his engagement, but I'll make some general comments as to what I think that engagement should look like. I don't know what goes on behind the scenes. And, you know, because I don't want a Monday morning quarterback, because only 42 people have sat in that seat. I was the 40th, so I understand the nuances that ultimately the political leader in this area is Mike Duggan. So, you know, nothing would happen without his approval. With that being said, what a healthy engagement looks like, it is not one where the feds come in and tell you what they want to do in your local jurisdiction. That is really not heard of in policing. What it has been traditionally is that if you need the coordinated resource of the feds, and you work with them every day, that is not uncommon. What is uncommon is a interjection of federal enforcement where it was not asked for. I find I have a huge problem with that. To me, it violates the tenets of local control. It really is overreach in a lot of ways.
In a city that is traumatized about losing local control, right?
I mean, you know, I mean, we've seen it, Orlando. You know, going from losing our water department, which Coleman Young tried to tell us for years. They want the water. Our water department is now regionalized. Going through the bankruptcy, and a lot of the Belle Isle does not belong to us anymore. I mean, just a number of things that have disenfranchised and removed the Mac and Bewick Detroiters, the Linwood and Philadelphia Detroiters. I'm not talking about the newly transplanted and welcome Detroiters in the Midtown and downtown area. You know, we always, you know, welcome and want, you know, greater participation of a multicultural community. However, a lot of people are being left behind and disenfranchised, and so for the feds to come in, and then to add to that, Orlando, the president just made an announcement that the Fair Housing Act that President Obama, Vice President Biden fought to keep in place, in just such a horrendously, overtly racist way to say we're not going to let Black folks come and destroy your suburbs. He didn't use those words, but those are the sentiments, and not missed by anybody. So when you add all that together, this level of federal intervention, it looks more like a dictatorship, than it does a representative democracy, which we've enjoyed. What this administration has exposed, a number of things that were really presidential decorum are not law. And we got to go back to the drawing board and really look at what we've extended to the presidency relative to the ability to have someone sit in that seat that has a moral consciousness, because it is absent now. And we are finding day by day, and every time you think it can't get any worse, like, you know, no, the hell he didn't. You look up and yes, the hell he did. And yes, the hell he is. And again, going back to the conversation about tweeting about moving the election, these are the kind of things that people should be energized at a level that they have never been energized before. I have done everything to go by the science of the COVID-19. But on election day, if I have to catch COVID to vote that man out, I got to do it for my child. I got to do it for my grandchild that's coming along, because it's so much at stake in November that another 4 years with this person in place would be the end of the United States as we know it.
Earlier you talked a little bit about some folks having to follow commands beyond what their own moral compass would be. And we know that Matthew Snyder answers to Attorney General Bill Barr and eventually served,
and he's a political appointment,
President Donald Trump.
Yes.
And so do you believe in the integrity of the Trump administration to not enter, even with Operation Legend, do you believe that they will hold to not interfering with protesters as they have in Portland and in other cities?
I am not confident that they will hold to just the very strict line of what Operation Legend is. And one thing that, you know, if you talk to political operatives, if you talk to law enforcement across the country, there's something called scope creep. And the feds, I don't care what they come in for, if they see something else, they do have the ability to go beyond the scope of what their intended purpose is. So I don't want any protester, I don't want anybody to be fooled to think that regardless of what's said in the press conference, that if there's something that has a federal nexus that they can articulate, the feds can go much further than what their intended purpose is.
Wow.
And that's the part that concerns me, especially when you look at the ability to interrupt free speech and protesters, that it is remarkable to me how much attention that this Justice Department pays to protesters that protest in behalf of Black lives. Yet when subversive terrorists like white supremacists go to the Capitol and they have weapons, there is no federal intervention. As a matter of fact, they go above and beyond to make sure that those individuals are expressing their freedom of speech and right to assembly. And it is so blatantly obvious that if the protest happens to be against the policies and procedures that are embraced by this administration, Bill Barr takes great interest in those protesters, and even the nomenclature and language they use. And, you know, I will point this out. They are starting to publicize, which we already know, that the gentleman in Minneapolis with the black on with the umbrella that was busting windows is a white supremacist with the express intent of disrupting the peaceful protest and with the intent of hopefully inciting a race war. So when you know these things, we are not stupid at all. You cannot urinate on our ear and tell us it's raining. So when you see these blatant hypocrisies and contradictions in how the Justice Department is being so blatantly partisan, it's not hard to stand up against that. So there should be a level of concern. I don't want people to be panicked, but there should be concern that the feds have interjected themselves absent an invitation. That is not an
invitation. Yeah. And, you know, there was this conflation on part of the U.S. Attorney about federal officers coming to intervene because there's an uptick in violent crime due to anti-police rhetoric and from people being released from jails and prisons due to COVID concerns. What do that go together? Does that go together?
I think that's a reach to make that conclusion without any factual basis, without any research to support that. Rhetorically sounds good, but the people that have been released have been nonviolent offenders, number one. If you look at the types of violent actions that have happened, for instance, the shooting in the Coney Island, how do you tie that to anti-police rhetoric? Those were citizen-on-citizen encounters that, number one, you're in a depressed, economic state. And when you have an economy that is completely collapsed due to the failure of an administration to address a pandemic in a way that would reduce the economic impact, it is sheerly economics, Orlando. So a lot of the crime and uptick in crime we see, that's more attributable to the just distressed financial position that the United States is in. And it must be noted that if white America is hurting financially and the wealth gap is 10 times between that and the Black community, then how much deleterious is the effects on our community? So these
Black
things
always bear the brunt. Yeah.
Yes, we bear the brunt. From a criminology standpoint, criminologists will tell you the socioeconomic impact has much more to do than anti-police rhetoric. That's not what's driving crime. What's driving crime is people's desire to eat, people's desire to pay their bills, people's desire to have the basic needs. Orlando, I know you're aware of the Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Your basic level needs, if they're not met, you have anarchy. And when you have a lack of leadership in Washington that would allow a pandemic to first be called fake news, and then you say it's not real, and up until 3 days ago, discourage the wearing of masks, and then the day later you tweet out one of the most horrific press conferences that has no factual basis at all about the current medical situation. So this is really an amalgamation of all of these failures along the way of the Trump administration. And the manifestation, the symptom is the crime, but the root cause is economic despair.
Yeah, and you know, I think it is irresponsible on part of folks in power
Very irresponsible.
to criminalize poverty in that way,
Mm-hmm.
and to criminalize
Yes.
trauma because it shows up differently, especially
Yes.
in Black communities. So to
Mm-hmm.
conflate violent crime and the uptick of violent crime to anti-police rhetoric and people being released from prison and jails because of COVID, I think is pretty dangerous. I want to talk to you. Yeah, I want to talk to you about where if what we're seeing in terms of the uptick in violent crime is abnormal for this particular time of the year. It's summertime, and then we do have some, as you mentioned, some compounding issues. But I heard a colleague say that she's been in Detroit all of her life, and she can't remember a time where violent crime was not a problem that the city was trying to grapple and deal with. Should we be worried?
We should be worried anytime there's violent crime. I think your friend's observation is an astute observation. Statistically, this is not the worst it's been. The difference is that we have images that go across a broad spectrum of social media, goes across the traditional media that we did not always have access to. For instance, the Coney Island shooting. It was shared on Instagram. Numbers be damned, regardless of what the crime situation is. For people that are not used to seeing that, there's a level of trauma that comes with watching somebody get murdered like that. So my belief is, and I think it's a reasonable hypothesis, is that we are privy to see things that we only heard about before. And that even goes to the level of police brutality and a lot of what was believed to be anecdotal stories. They're not anecdotal anymore. We watched Eric Garner be murdered on camera. We watched Eric Floyd be murdered on camera. We watched a gentleman in South Carolina running from the police and murdered in cold blood, shot in the back. We watched these things. So I think what's different now, Orlando, is that we can see the things that we only heard about before. And that visual, I think, exacerbates the trauma in our community.
So my last question my last prompt actually is to give you an opportunity to address these Detroiters with a message. What is your message to Detroiters? We know that we're going to see additional federal officers. All of the precincts where the Attorney General, not the Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney cited were precincts on the west side of the city. And I'm sure that there is, again, a level of uncertainty and fear, especially, Detroit and the feds. We talk about the 67 rebellion. My parents tell stories about the National Guard. There is this palpable discomfort when we talk about feds coming into the city. What's your message to Detroiters as we begin to grapple with this very real reality?
Well, I think our political activism, it cannot stop. I think it's very necessary. I think we need to remain peacefully active. We need to protest, and we need to continue to make our voices heard. As it goes to the federal government being involved, be cautious, but know your rights, because I think that's a very important thing, because fear and intimidation has been the methodology of law enforcement. And to the extent to where Detroit has been very, very on the front end of policing from the standpoint of community engagement. We went through 2 federal consent judgments, and I was chief of police when we kind of made a major leap towards constitutional policing. James Craig took it across the finish line. But I think it's very important that we continue the path that we're on, but we cannot lose sight of what's most important. And that is going to the polls in August for the primary and going to the polls in November. We have to make our political wherewithal known, and we have to flex our muscles politically in a way that traditionally we have not. And we have to be unified to the point of we support right policies. I tell people all the time, and this is from my ministerial background, right now I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. I'm a person that's looking for moral leadership, ethical leadership, and policies that support Black and brown communities. Right now, the Democratic Party has a platform that tends to be more favorable to Black and brown communities, but they got a lot of damn work to do too. So that's why the activism is important. But it's important for the Orlando Baileys of the world, for your voices to be out front. And then I would say this lastly, I want our younger generation that has the energy to tap into my generation that has some experience. And it's not an either or, but this is a time for us to give you the historical context of some of the things that intuitively you all know are wrong. I'm very pleased to see the level of activism. It's not just Black people. It's white people realizing. It's Jewish people realizing. It's people from the Nation of Islam. It's people from the Muslim faith, Christian, Judaism, agnostic. Good people can recognize that our system fundamentally is not working for a great part of our population. And so I really want to see us work together more, have more conversation like you and I are having now. I have some historical context. I know you're a great student of history and you study. We've got to be storytellers in our community as we used to be. That was the strength of us. We didn't have Instagram. We didn't have Twitter. We didn't have Snapchat. We wasn't on TikTok. But we gathered around the elders and we told the stories. And then the next generation had the energy to live out our experience. I think that's the point we're at now, Orlando. I'm optimistic. As crazy as things are now, I'm more optimistic now than I have been for a while, because there's been a level of apathy, and particularly in my era, because we've gotten good jobs and we've, achieved a quote unquote American dream. And I mean this rhetorically. A lot of us have felt that, okay, we made it. We had a Black president. No, that is not that does not replace some of the systemic issues that still need to be fixed in broken communities. So let's keep fighting, fight till we win, be activists. I just think in this season, we have to think outside of ourselves. And I want to give a compliment to your generation, Orlando, because I know you've heard this for years. These young kids don't care about nothing. They selfish, they're this, they're that. But the reality is your generation is the generation that has stirred up the United States of America and shown the world what the aspirational values that America espouses to be. You all are living those out. So thank you. And I want every person your age and in your age range to know that it is noticed and it is appreciated, and you have our support. And thank you for your courage and your tenacity. And anything I can do to lend to the conversation to help, call on me anytime.
We appreciate you, Chief Godbee, and thank you for making room for this intergenerational exchange. I will implore you to challenge those in your generation to do the same thing, because you believe it or not, these kinds of conversations are actually hard to come by, and someone who knows. So I appreciate it. Chief Ralph Godbee, former Chief of the Detroit Police Department and current Chief of the Detroit Public Schools Community District Police Department. Thank you so much for being with us today.
God bless you, Orlando. Keep doing the work, man.
Will do.